The paper Miss Doyne laid upon our breakfast table was a printed calendar of convictions, and the line she had marked in pencil read, Ezra Kell, waterman, age 31. Willful murder of Nathaniel Sperry. Guilty. Judgment of death recorded. The sessions at which that verdict was returned had been held on Monday, the 14th of October. Nathaniel Sperry was alive on the 14th of October. He was taken out of the Thames at Bell Stairs on the morning of the 17th with the back of his head broken, and Ezra Kell had never been tried at all. At that hour he was in Horsemonger Lane Jail, waiting upon a trial fixed for the Thursday of the following week. A printer's blunder, I said. That is what the Home Office called it on Monday. Miss Doyne kept her hands folded very tightly in her lap. On Tuesday they will call it forgery, and they will say my father wrote it, because the entry is in the register as well as in the print, and the register is in his hand, and my father has kept that register for 41 years. Holmes had taken up the calendar and was holding it at a low angle to the window as a man reads a watermark. Your father is clerk to the justices at Salt Yard? Copying clerk to the clerk of the peace. He engrosses the minutes. He is 63. She hesitated. His sight is not good. How not good? He wears spectacles. That is not an answer, Miss Doyne, but it will do for the present. He set the paper down. Who found the entry? A gentleman of the press. The calendars go out to the newspapers each quarter. He wrote to the coroner asking whether the court had second sight. Her mouth moved without becoming a smile. It has been in 3 papers. There is a placard outside the Sessions House. And Kell? They say in Salt Yard that it only proves what everybody knew, that the court had him marked, that he is guilty and the writing simply came early. She looked up. Mr. Holmes, my father cannot see the page in front of him. He cannot defend himself because he cannot read the thing they say he wrote. On Tuesday there is to be an inquiry, and the clerk of the peace has told him not to attend the office until it is over. Is your father a poor man? He is a clerk who has been 41 years at £90. Yes. And Sperry, what was he? Usher at the court when I was a child. He grew too old for it, and they made him night watchman. He had the keys. She paused. He was fond of my father. He was fond of nobody else that I know of. Holmes rose and reached for his coat. Watson, the 11:20 from Charing Cross will do us no good. It is a matter of a cab. Miss Doyne, I make no promises about your father, but I will tell you the one thing I am already sure of, since it costs me nothing, and may cost him a night's sleep less. Whoever wrote that line did not write it in error. A man does not err into naming a murderer 3 days before there is a murder. That entry was made deliberately, and it was made to be found. The Salt Yard Sessions House stood on the Suffolk bank between a hop warehouse and a rope walk. A low brick building of the last century, sinking at one corner, with a smell of river running through it as steadily as a draught. It was to be closed within the year, the clerk of the peace told us, and the business removed to Newington. He was a harassed, decent man who spoke of the affair as one speaks of a death in the family, and he took us down himself to the strong room. That room lay at the back of the building, half a flight below the level of the yard. It was stone-floored, barrel-vaulted, and lined from floor to spring of the arch with calf-bound volumes, each with its year in gilt on a red label. There was a smell in it I have not met elsewhere. Old leather, damp brick, and camphor, which they scattered in the presses against the worm. It got into the throat, and it stayed on the clothes afterwards. At the far end, 4 steps went up to a low, iron-bound door. Where does that give? Onto the stairs. Salt Yard Stairs, the old Watergate. Prisoners came up that way in my grandfather's time. It is bolted. It is bolted now, said Holmes, who had gone up the steps in 3 strides and was on his knees with his lens out. He came down again without saying what he had seen, and asked for the current minute book. It was brought and opened on the table under the gas. I looked over his shoulder at the page for the 14th of October. 11 cases in a neat, old-fashioned, upright hand, each with its number in the margin, the offence, the finding, the sentence. Drunk and disorderly, assault, larceny of a coat, keeping an unlicensed house, and at the foot of the page, on the last 2 ruled lines, the 12th entry. Ezra Kell, waterman, age 31, willful murder of Nathaniel Sperry, guilty. Judgment of death recorded. Mr. Doyne swears he never wrote it, said the clerk of the peace unhappily, but it is his hand. I have read his hand for 19 years. It is a hand very like his, said Holmes. Be so good as to bring me a candle, a sheet of blotting paper, and, if the building can furnish it, a bottle of the ordinary ink. He worked for the better part of 40 minutes and said almost nothing. He measured the entry with a folding rule. He turned the leaf and studied the reverse against the light. He held the candle at a hand's breadth from the page and tilted it until the strokes threw a shadow. He wetted the point of a needle and touched it, once to the tail of the letter Y in Ezra, and examined the needle through his lens. Then he straightened, and I saw that he had what he wanted. 3 things, he said. First, every other entry on this page was written with a quill. This one was written with a steel nib. You may see it for yourself, Watson. The quill spreads and the shading dies away. The steel leaves 2 lines, one for each side of the point, and it has scratched the paper twice at the crossing of the Tums second. The ink is young. Not new, it has had a month, perhaps 5 weeks to blacken, but it lifts on a wet needle, and the ink of the entry above it, which is a month older only, does not. I could put the writing of this line between the 12th and the 20th of October, and I should not be far out. The clerk of the peace passed a hand across his mouth. Then, it was written before Sperry died. It may have been. Hold that thought. It is the ugliest one in the room. Third, and to my mind, the most useful. Holmes laid his finger beside the number in the margin. The number of this case is ruled underneath in red. We looked. It was a fine red line beneath the figure 12 drawn with a ruler. So it is, said the clerk. That is... He stopped. That is nothing whatever, said Holmes, in a book of 1866. It is the old practice of this court. The forms were altered when the sessions were reorganized in 1871, unless my memory is at fault, and the red rule went out with them. There is not a red rule anywhere else in this volume. There is not one in any volume on that shelf behind you. Your forger took great pains with Mr. Doyne's hand, and he took them over a page written more than 20 years ago, and he copied the trick along with the letters. He shut the book. There is a 4th thing which is not evidence but is instructive. This is a court of general sessions of the peace. It has no more power to try a man for murder than I have. Whoever wrote that line either did not know it or wanted the thing to be impossible twice over, so that no ingenious person could ever argue it into sense. The clerk of the peace stood among his books, looking suddenly much older. Then who came in here? That, said Holmes, is the question I had hoped you would ask, because it is the only one that matters this morning. The register does not leave this room. Never. It is locked at night. That door and the outer door both. Sperry had the keys. Sperry had the keys, Holmes repeated. And on the 17th of October somebody broke Sperry's head. We came up the stairs into the yard and stood a moment by the shut water gate, where the river slapped against green stone 8 feet below. You see how the case has altered in an hour, said Holmes. Miss Doyne came to us about a clerk's disgrace. We are no longer looking at a clerk. We are looking at a man who wanted a night alone in that room, who bought or borrowed the only pair of keys in Southwark that would give it him, and who 3 days later found it necessary to kill the man who held them. Josiah Doyne received us in 2 rooms over a stationer's in Union Street, and I understood his daughter's evasion within a minute of crossing the threshold. He was a tall, spare old man, very clean, very upright, with a black cravat and the grey stoop of a lifetime over a desk. He came to meet us with his hand out at the wrong height and a half-second late. The lamp stood at his left elbow and he never once turned his face to it. When Holmes put the printed calendar into his hands, he held it out at the full stretch of his arm, moved it slowly to one side, and gave it back. "You must read it to me," he said with enormous dignity. "The print is poor." "Mr. Doyne," said I, "will you permit me? I am a medical man." I took the lamp, and he suffered me to look at him, and Hester Doyne stood by the fireplace and watched us with her hands behind her back. There was no need for any nicety of examination. Both lenses were clouded, the right almost wholly. He could tell light from dark and shape from shape, and beyond that, nothing. "How long?" I asked. "It has been coming on some years." "How long have you been unable to read?" The old man's jaw set. "I engross the minutes of the salt yard sessions," he said. "I have engrossed them since the year 50. There is not a blot in 41 years. "That is not what Dr. Watson asked you, sir," said Holmes gently. "It is what I answer." We were 10 minutes with him and got nothing further. At the door his daughter gave us our hats, and Holmes, taking his, said in a low voice, "Miss Doyne, when you employed the word engross to me this morning, you were careful to make your father the subject of the verb. Do not do it again. It will be worse for you if I have to find it out for myself, and worse for him." She looked back at him with a white, steady face. "He would be turned off," she said. "There is no pension for a man turned off. He is 63. I know it. I am not the inquiry. Good day." In the street I said, "You knew before we went in." "I suspected in Baker Street." She said he wears spectacles, which is what a daughter says when she has said the true thing so often in her own mind that she is frightened of it. And the register is written in a hand with no sign of failing sight at all. No wandering line, no double inking, none of the things a half-blind penman cannot help. Somebody has been writing that book for years, Watson, and doing it lovingly, in another man's hand. It is a forgery 41 years' service long, and it has nothing to do with our murder except this, that it makes those 2 people the only creatures in England who cannot afford to tell the truth. The inquest on Nathaniel Sperry had been held and adjourned, and the depositions were with the police, but the body was still above ground at the parish mortuary, and it was as a medical man that I got my hour with it while Holmes went to find Inspector Bradstreet. I record only what mattered. Sperry had not drowned. There was no froth in the air passages, no water in the stomach, none of the ballooning of the lung that a man carries out of the river with him. He had received a single blow on the back of the head, a little to the left, from something with an edge, but not a sharp one, the corner of a stone, I thought, or of an iron-bound sill, and he had been dead, in my judgment, before he ever went into the water. The divisional surgeon had noted as much in 3 lines and gone home. 2 things he had not noted. The heels of Sperry's boots were scored and stripped across the back, both of them alike, in a way no man's boots wear by walking. He had been dragged, on his back, over stone. And when I turned out the coat, which hung on a peg with the rest of his clothes, there came up out of the cloth a smell I had breathed for the first time an hour before. I carried the coat to the window and beat the shoulder of it over a sheet of paper and got a little dust, a fine red powder, brick dust from a crumbling wall, and mixed through it small pale grains and flakes. Camphor. Bradstreet came down to the mortuary with Holmes at 3 o'clock, a big, slow-spoken, careful man whom I had known to be right rather oftener than his colleagues. He heard me out, put his thumb on the scored heels, sniffed the paper, and said, "Well, you had a case against Kell," said Holmes. "I had a good case against Kell, Mr. Holmes, and I'll not pretend otherwise. Sperry had been going about saying Kell robbed him of £4 over a boat, and Kell had said in the bunch of grapes with 6 men listening that he'd break the old thief's head. Kell has no account of himself that night. Kell's skiff was wet at 8 in the morning when the constable saw it, and Bell Stairs is 9 minutes from Kell's door. He set his hat on the slab, and Kell is the only man in it that anybody wanted to hang. You have no faith in it. I have faith in what I can carry to a jury." Bradstreet nodded at the coat. "That's the Sessions House, that smell. I've been in that strong room. If he never drowned, and he was dragged over stone, and he's got the strong room in his coat, then he died in the strong room, or on the stairs below it, and somebody put him in the water afterwards to make it look like the road home. And that's a thing Ezra Kell could not do, because Ezra Kell hadn't a key to any door in Salt Yard. Unless Sperry admitted him." "Aye." Bradstreet looked at Holmes. "Unless Sperry admitted him. Sperry admitted somebody, didn't he?" We went back to Salt Yard that night with the clerk of the peace's leave and a bull's-eye lantern, and it took Holmes 11 minutes. The strong-room floor had been swept, but a stone floor under presses of old paper never comes clean. There is always the fine grey fall of decaying leather along the base of the shelves. In that fall, running from a point some 4 feet out from the reading table to the foot of the Watergate steps, were 2 parallel scores, boot-heel wide, 4 inches apart. On the 3rd step there was a dark stain the size of my palm, gone into the stone. Holmes scraped a little of it into a pillbox, and the next morning at Baker Street he dropped the scrapings into distilled water and added the reagent of his own devising, and the brown precipitate came down as it always does. It was blood, and it had been on that step some 3 or 4 weeks. But the thing that changed the case that night was on the other side of the room, and Holmes found it while I was still on my knees over the stain. "Watson, bring the lantern." He was standing at the shelves that held the older volumes, the last century and the first 60 years of this one. There was a gap in them, a clean gap of some 5 feet, at shoulder height, and the dust on the empty board was disturbed in a broad smear at one end. "They have taken away the old books." "Not all." Holmes ran the light along. 1801 to 1848 remain. 1849 to 1870 are gone, 22 years. The next morning the clerk of the peace explained it without the smallest embarrassment. The Sessions House was to be given up. The county had no room at Newington for 160 feet of superseded minute books. There was an order, he showed it, for the destruction of the series to 1870, the papers to be sold as waste for what they would fetch, and the proceeds credited to the county rate. The books had gone down to the contractor's wharf on the 3rd of November, and would go from there to a mill at Rotherhithe and to the rag engine on Saturday. "And who is the contractor?" "Vale," said the clerk of the peace. "Vale's wharf at Horsley Down. He carries most things for the county." "Mr. Cornelius Vale." Holmes wrote the name in his cuff, which was his habit when he did not wish a thing to be seen written. "Now, Watson," he said as we came out into the November glare of the yard, "let us take stock, for we have arrived somewhere, and I do not want us to arrive there twice." A man wished to spend a night in the strong room of the Salt Yard Sessions House. He paid the watchman for it, or frightened him into it. He was there long enough to study the hand of the court's copying clerk in the volumes of 20 years ago, long enough to take up a trick of the pen that has been dead since 1871. And he wrote at the foot of a current page a line which is not merely a lie, but a visible lie, a lie that cannot be swallowed by anybody, a lie designed to make every man who reads it say aloud, "The books of this court are false." 3 nights later he came back, or he was let in, and he killed the watchman on those steps and carried him down to the water. And now the question that governs everything else. Not who, not how. Why should any man on earth want it publicly established that the registers of a shabby little sessions house in Southwark are not to be believed? I said, because there is something in them he cannot answer. Because there is something in them he cannot answer, Holmes agreed, and it is not in the current book, or he would have cut it out and had done. It is in the old books. He was reading the old books, and the old books are on a wharf at Horselydown waiting to be boiled into pulp on Saturday under an order which he himself is paid to execute. They let us into Horsemonger Lane at noon. Ezra Kell was a short, thick-shouldered man with a waterman's forearms and the grey face that jail gives in 3 weeks. He had been told that a gentleman had come about his case, and he had evidently decided during the walk from his cell to be insolent, which is a thing frightened men do. "You'll be from the newspaper," he said. "I am not. They printed I was found guilty." He laughed, 1 syllable. "Found guilty of a murder 3 days before there was one. There's a joke for you. My sister read it to me through the grating. She said, 'Ezra, they had you wrote down before ever the old man was dead.'" "Mr. Kell," said Holmes, "I have exactly one thing to say to you, and then I shall ask you a question. The thing is this. I do not believe you killed Nathaniel Sperry, and I can prove that he did not die where the police believe he died. The question is, what were you doing on the river on the night of the 16th? Kell's face closed like a door. "I was in my bed." "You were not. Your boat was wet at 8 the next morning, and there had been no rain. You have told the police nothing, and they have taken your silence for guilt, which is what silence is for. Now, you may hang for a murder, or you may be committed for whatever it is you were about that night. Choose quickly. Your trial is on Thursday." The man sat with his hands hanging between his knees for the better part of a minute. "Coal," he said at last. "From the barges. Off the tier below Salt Yard. 1/2 ton a night out of the top of a lighter, and no man the wiser, and the wharfinger writes it off to spillage." He looked up with a sort of misery. "I've a sister and her 3. What was I to say? I was on the water at 2 in the morning under the sessions house with a sack of another man's coal, at the very hour they say I broke his head. There's no jury in London would hear the rest of it." "There is one man in London who will." "What did you see?" "A skiff," said Kell. "Come out from Salt Yard stairs." "At what hour?" "Near the top of the flood, 2:30 or a bit past. I heard the gate go. That gate's got an iron bar, and it cries out. And I lay in under the tier and watched her come off. One man rowing. He rowed badly at the start, and then he got it. And there was something in the stern under a piece of tarpaulin, and it was low in the water for one man." "Which way?" "Down. Across and down, on the last of the flood, towards the far shore. He'd have gone in at Bell Stairs or thereabouts on the slack." Kell's jaw worked. "I never knowed what it was. Not till the Friday, when they took me." "Could you swear to the man?" "No. He was a black shape." "Could you swear to the boat?" Kell looked at him with the first real attention he had shown. "Mister," he said, "I've been on this river since I was 9. I don't know faces. I know boats." Vale's wharf at Horselydown was a good property. 200 feet of frontage, a crane, a granary, 4 lighters on the mud, and a 5th loading. Holmes presented himself as a buyer in the paper trade, with an interest in a parcel of waste, and we were shown up to a counting-house that smelt of tar and beeswax. Cornelius Vale was a strongly built man of 47, with a fresh colour, thick, iron-grey hair, and the manner of a man who has been listened to for 20 years and enjoys it. He came round the desk to shake hands. He had a waterman's hands still, broad and hard, with the nails cut square. "Books," he said when Holmes had made his pretence. "You're the third this month. There's no money in books, sir. Rag's the thing. Old ledgers is size and glue and dirt, and the boiler makes a poor grey stuff of them fit for nothing but grocer's bags. Yet you have contracted to carry them. I've contracted to carry whatever the county's tired of, and I've carried some queer freights for them." He laughed comfortably. "That parcel goes to Rotherhithe Saturday. You may look at it if you've the stomach for a shed full of mildew." "You are lately on the Commission of the Peace, I think," said Holmes. "I saw your name." Vale's pleasure in this was frank and entirely unashamed. "The 18th of December I'm sworn. 40 years ago I was pulling a pair of sculls for 8p a fare off those stairs down there. Now there's men that will call me your worship." He said it with real feeling, and I found to my discomfort that I liked him. Holmes bought nothing but asked for a memorandum of the terms, and Vale took a sheet of his own paper and wrote it out for us there, and then 4 lines, the tonnage, the price, and the number of the lot. He ruled the number of the lot underneath in red, with a little brass-edged ruler he took from his waistcoat, and blotted it and handed it over. We were 50 yards along Shad Thames before Holmes spoke. "You saw?" He underlined the figure, in red with a rule, beneath the number, precisely as the clerks of Salt Yard did until the year 1871, and as no living soul has done since, and as our forger did at the foot of the page for the 14th of October. Holmes walked another 20 paces. A man who spends 4 nights copying a dead hand does not put it off with his coat. It gets into the fingers. Nothing on earth would persuade a jury of it, but you and I need not trouble a jury yet. Then we have him. We have a suspicion, an underlined number, and a shed full of books that he burns on Saturday." Holmes stopped and looked back at the wharf. "Watson, I have been asking the wrong question all morning. I have been asking what is in those books. I should have been asking why a man about to be made a magistrate would kill an old court usher rather than let him talk. Bradstreet found it for us that afternoon, in an hour, by the simple police method of asking the Sessions House porter what he had seen and giving him a shilling for saying so. The porter had seen nothing at night. He did not sleep on the premises. But in the last week of September and the first week of October, 3 or 4 times, old Sperry had asked him to help carry books up from the strong room to the empty grand jury room and to carry them down again in the morning. Big old ones, the porter said, with the red labels. Sperry had said it was for the sorting, on account of the removal. Sperry had given him 6p each time, which was not like Sperry at all. And Sperry had lately paid off 11 shillings at the chandler's, which was still less like him. "Did you notice the years?" Holmes asked. "60s," said the porter. 60-something. I can't read the gilt on the ones that's rubbed." And that evening Bradstreet came to Baker Street with his coat still buttoned and a slip of paper in his hand, and said, without sitting down, "Cornelius Vale, Sessions of the Peace at Salt Yard, Michaelmas Quarter, 1869. I had it out of the old jail books at Newington, which nobody thought to burn. Perjury. 18 months hard labour. He was 19. Holmes did not move from the fire. "On whose account?" "A man named Byatt. Vale swore him into a warehouse robbery he was never in, swore he saw him carrying. Swore to the hour and the coat. Byatt got 7 years and died at Portland in his 5th. 2 years after, Vale's own accomplice broke down over another business and let it out, and the Crown prosecuted Vale for the perjury and got him." Bradstreet turned his hat around in his hands. "It's 22 years. He came out and worked and prospered, and never a stain since. And in 5 weeks' time he was to be sworn a Justice of the Peace for the county of Surrey." Was he indeed? Said Holmes. And a newspaper had only to send a boy to Salt Yard with the name and a pencil. That's it. There's no other record left of it that I can find, bar the jail calendar I turned up by luck this afternoon. The depositions were destroyed years back. The papers of that quarter are gone. There's nobody living who sat in that court, but— He stopped. But the usher who stood at the dock rail, said Holmes, and who has been looking at Cornelius Vale's face across a Southwark bar parlour for 20 years without ever putting the two together, until in September the newspapers were good enough to print that face over the words "Our new magistrate." He got up and went to the window and stood there with his back to us. Now attend, both of you, because the shape of this thing is worth a moment. Vale needed 1 page out of 1 book destroyed. That is easily done. He is the contractor. The whole series was condemned. He had only to wait until Saturday and let the rag engine do it, and no man would ever have known. But Vale is a careful man, and a careful man does not lean his whole weight upon one precaution. Suppose the order were countermanded. Suppose an archivist grew tender-hearted. Suppose some clerk had already copied the entry. What then? Then Vale wanted a second wall behind the first. He wanted it so that if ever, at any time, any person produced the Salt Yard registers and said, "See, here is the conviction of Cornelius Vale," the answer would be ready, and the answer would be devastating. The Salt Yard registers are forgeries. The whole series was written up by a blind old man and his daughter. There is an entry in them convicting a man of a murder 3 days before the murder was committed. Ask the Home Office. It was in the newspapers. I saw it then, and it turned me cold in a way the mortuary had not. He did not forge a record to conceal a murder, I said. He committed a murder to spoil a record. Holmes turned round. The entry was not the crime, Watson. The entry was the poison he put in the well, so that nothing drawn out of it afterwards should ever be drinkable. And he wrote it on the night of the 14th of October, in the same sitting in which he cut out his own page and studied his hand, because that was the night Sperry admitted him with the keys, and Sperry was to die on the 17th, and after the 17th there would be a new watchman and new locks, and he would never get into that room again as long as he lived. He did not date it 3 days early out of insolence. He dated it 3 days early because it was the only page in the book that existed on the only night he had. Bradstreet said slowly, then he had already settled to kill the old man when he wrote it. He had settled it, said Holmes, before he sharpened the pen. The inquiry sat at 10 on Tuesday morning in the grand jury room at Salt Yard, and it went as badly as it is possible for a thing to go. There were 5 of them at the table: the clerk of the peace, 2 justices, a gentleman from the Home Office who wrote everything down, and a handwriting expert from Chancery Lane who had been given 3 days and the whole shelf. Bradstreet sat at the end. Holmes and I were suffered to sit against the wall, and along the wall from us, having attended in the character of a magistrate designate of the county and a man with an interest in the removal of the records, sat Cornelius Vale with his hat on his knee. The expert was heard first. He was neither a fool nor a rogue. He was simply asked the wrong question. Was the disputed entry in the hand that had written the rest of the register? It was. Was that hand the hand of Josiah Doyne, of whose writing he had been furnished with specimens from 1852, 1863, and 1874? It was, and here he grew unhappy, and said that the register hand of the last 3 years, while it was unquestionably a continuation of the same hand, showed a firmness and regularity he would not have looked for in a gentleman of Mr. Doyne's years. Then they brought Josiah Doyne in. He came the length of the room with his daughter's hand under his arm and his chin up, and he stood where they put him and answered in a clear voice that he had never in his life written the words, Ezra Kell. The Home Office gentleman said, "Mr. Doyne, on what date did you engross the minutes of the 14th of October?" On the 16th. Describe the ink you used. The office ink. And the pen. A quill. I have never used a steel pen. Mr. Doyne, said the Home Office gentleman quite kindly, will you read the disputed entry aloud to us? The book was on the table. They put it into his hands. He held it at arm's length and turned it a little to the light, and the room waited, and the clerk of the peace put his hand over his eyes. The print is poor, said Josiah Doyne. It is not print, sir. It is your own hand. He stood there holding the book. I have seen men shot, and I have seen men told they were dying, and I do not think I have watched anything harder than that old man standing in the middle of the floor of the court he had served for 41 years, holding a page he could not see. Hester Doyne said, "It is mine." Nobody moved. "The hand is mine," she said. "Not that entry. The book. All of that book, and the two before it, and the greater part of the one before that. My father has not been able to read for 3 years, and he has not written a word of the minutes for 3 years. He brings the rough sheets home, and I read them to him, and he tells me the forms, and I write them, and he carries them back. I have his hand exactly. I learned it out of the old volumes when I was 14, because I thought it the most beautiful writing in the world." She had not raised her voice at all. "I did it so that he should not be turned off. I have known every day for 3 years that it was a crime. It is my crime and not his, and I will say so anywhere you like, but you are not to say that he wrote that lie because he did not, and neither did I." The Home Office gentleman wrote for some time. What followed took 40 minutes, and I shall put it in 6 lines. The registers of the Salt Yard sessions for the last 3 years were declared unfit to be received. The question of the earlier series was reserved, and the gentleman from the Home Office observed that, as the earlier series was in any case condemned to destruction, the point was academic. Josiah Doyne was suspended. Hester Doyne was told that she would be required to attend before a magistrate, and that she should get herself a solicitor. The clerk of the peace, who had gone the colour of tallow, said that he must consider his own position, and at the wall Cornelius Vale sat quietly with his hat on his knee, and once, when the Home Office gentleman used the phrase "no reliance whatever," he looked down at the floor as a man looks down who does not wish his face to be read. Outside in the yard, Bradstreet said, "That was as neat a piece of work as ever I saw, and he never spoke a word in it." "He spoke a word in it in October," said Holmes. "Everything since has been the machine running. Inspector, I want 2 things of you before dark, and I do not much mind how you get them." "Name them." "Ezra Kell, out of Horsemonger Lane. You have a body that did not drown, a dead man dragged across the floor of a room Kell could not enter, blood on the Watergate step, and the strong room's own dust in the dead man's coat. Take it to the Treasury solicitor this afternoon, and tell him you will not put that case to a jury on Thursday. He'll not thank me. And the second? Fetch me the schedule of the lot at Vale's Wharf, the county's own list of what was carted out of that strong room on the 3rd of November. I want to know that Michaelmas 1869 was on it. It was on it. Bradstreet had the schedule in Baker Street by 6, and the entry was there in the clerk of the peace's own hand. Cess. Mins. Miche. 1869. 1 volume. And at 8:15 that evening, Ezra Kell walked out of Horsemonger Lane Jail into a fog, and came, because he had nowhere else to go, and Bradstreet had told him to Baker Street, where he sat on the edge of a chair and drank Mrs. Hudson's soup, and said nothing at all for half an hour. "Now," said Holmes, when the man had got some colour, "we are in a difficulty, and I will tell you both what it is, because I am tired of being the only person in this room who is frightened. We can prove that the entry is false. We cannot prove who wrote it. A red rule is not evidence. We can prove Sperry died in the strong room, and went into the river from the water gate. We cannot prove whose hands put him there. We have a motive, the fairest motive I ever handled. But the motive rests entirely upon a conviction recorded in a book, which is lying in a shed at Horselydown with 200 others, and which goes to the rag engine on Saturday morning. And there is worse, and it is my own doing. This morning that inquiry declared the salt yard registers unfit to be received. Vale sat and heard it. He has got what he wanted, and he has got it 3 days early. Then the book don't signify, said Kell, if they'll not believe the books. On the contrary, Holmes leaned forward. The book signifies more this evening than it has ever done, and Cornelius Vale knows it. And that is why I shall not sleep tonight. Consider, what condemned his forgery? Not the hand deceived an expert this morning. The ink of 5 weeks and ink of 20 years are 2 different substances, and any competent chemist can tell them apart on the page and swear to it. Vale learned that this morning. The expert said it aloud in that room. I said it myself in the strong room a week ago with the clerk of the peace listening. Now let the Michaelmas volume of 1869 come into a court of law. It does not matter in the least what any inquiry has said about the Doynes. There is his name on paper that is 22 years old, in ink that is 22 years old, in a hand that stopped writing before his daughter was born. No forger on earth can counterfeit that, and no board of inquiry can talk it away. The one wall he built has become the thing that will destroy him, because the very test that proved the new ink false will prove the old ink true. Bradstreet stood up. Then I'll have the shed sealed tonight. On what warrant? And on whose complaint? The books are the county's, condemned by the county's order, in the hands of the county's contractor. You would need to swear an information against a magistrate designate before a magistrate, and you would need to do it before Vale hears you have done it, and you would not be quicker than the telegraph or the gossip of the wharf. Holmes took out his watch. No, he must move, and he must move tonight or tomorrow, because Kell is out and the case is open again. I have had a boy on the corner of Shad Thames since Sunday. If Vale moves, we shall know within the half hour. The boy came at 4:20 in the morning, wet to the knees, and stood dripping on the hearthrug with his news. 2 lighters had been loaded at Vale's wharf from 11 at night by lantern light, and one of them was the paper. Mr. Vale himself had been down at midnight. The tug was ordered for the top of the ebb, and the lighters were to be at the mill at Rotherhithe by 6, and the mill had been paid to fire the boilers early. He has bought himself 36 hours, said Holmes, into his coat. Bradstreet is at Bermondsey Street Station. The boy will go for him. Watson, your revolver, and be so good as to bring the lantern. Kell, how long from Horselydown to Rotherhithe on the young ebb? 20 minutes pulling, said Kell, and I'll have you there in 15. Then we shall want 1 more passenger, and God forgive me for taking him. Union Street. And quickly. It was Hester Doyne who opened the door to us at 5 in the morning with a shawl over her nightdress and a candle in her hand, and it was Josiah Doyne standing behind her in the dark of the passage who said before either of us had spoken, "It is the books." "It is one book," said Holmes. "Michaelmas, 1869. It is in a shed at Rotherhithe among 200 that look exactly like it. It goes into the boiler within the hour. And I am told that the labels of that decade are rubbed illegible. Sir, I would not have come here to ask this. There is no one else alive who has handled those volumes." The old man was already reaching for his coat on its peg. He found it at the first attempt. 69, he said. The Michaelmas book of 69 is the one with the split board. The mill wharf at Rotherhithe was a black place at that hour, lit red down one side where the boiler-house doors stood open, and full of the smell of hot size. The books were in a long open shed with a tarred roof, not shelved, not stacked, but tipped out of the barge baskets in a heap the length of a room and the height of a man's chest, a hillside of brown and red calf sliding and settling, with here and there a spine flung out at an angle and a scatter of loose leaves trodden into the mud. 2 men with shovels and a barrow were feeding the near end of it into a hopper. Holmes had them stopped by the simple expedient of walking between them and the heap and saying that the police were behind him, which was true within 4 minutes. The foreman came out of the boiler house wiping his hands, and was disposed to argue, and was still arguing when Bradstreet arrived with 2 constables and put an end to it. And then there was nothing to do but the thing itself. We got a lantern up on a beam and another on a barrel. Kell and I worked from the mud upwards, turning the fallen books face up so that the gilt would catch. Hester Doyne went along the top of the heap on her knees like a gleaner. Holmes worked the flung-out spines. The labels were nearly all gone, rubbed to a smear of red, or eaten, or swollen off in the damp of the barge, and the gilt years that remained came up out of the lantern light in no sort of order. 1812, 1854, 1833, 1801, because the county's men had shovelled 22 years into baskets in the dark. Josiah Doyne stood at the edge of it with his hands out. "Give them to me," he said. "Do not read them to me. Give them to me." So we gave them to him. I shall remember it as long as I remember anything. The old man in his black cravat standing in the mud of a paper mill in the last of the night, with his daughter putting book after book into his hands, and his fingers going over each one the head and tail of the spine, the corners, the hinge, the width of the boards, the swell of the foredge 5 seconds, 4 seconds, 3 seconds, and then the shake of the head, and the book passed on to me, and the next book coming. And behind him, the boiler house doors standing open red, like something out of a sermon. He read 106 books with his hands. I counted them because counting was the only thing I could do. At 6 minutes past 6, with the sky going grey over the Surrey side, he stopped with the 107th in his hands, and his thumb went back along the front board and pressed again. "Split," he said, sprung at the head and mended with a strip of vellum, and the vellums lifted. 69. I mended it myself in the year the Prince came to the bridge. Holmes took it from him and had it open on the top of the barrel in the lantern light before the old man had finished speaking. And I saw the thing that I think he had feared all night. Between page 213 and page 215, there was no page 214. There was a stub, cut close into the sewing with a sharp knife and a steady hand, and the stub was clean. Hester Doyne made a small sound. "He has had it," said Bradstreet. "He has had the page," said Holmes. He turned the volume back to the front and opened the fly-leaves, and there, as there is at the front of every minute book of every court of quarter sessions in England, and as there had been at the front of every volume Holmes had handled in the strong room a week before, was the index, 2 columns to the page, the names of the year in alphabetical order, and against each a number. His finger went down the V's in the lantern light. Vale, Cornelius, waterman, aged 19, 214. "He cut out the leaf," said Holmes, "and he never thought of the index, because he had never in his life opened a book at the front, and the ink of that line is 22 years old, and I will bring a chemist into any court in England to swear to it." He was still speaking when Kell said, "From the mud, there's a skiff off the stairs." She was 30 yards out on the young ebb with 1 man in her, pulling hard, and she had come down along the wharves from the direction of the boiler house steps. How long Vale had been standing in the dark behind those open doors, watching a blind man read 107 books with his fingers, I have never known. He had come to see the thing burned. He had stayed too long, and he had waited, I suppose, exactly as long as it took him to see Holmes's finger stop in the index. Bradstreet's whistle went up and was answered from somewhere towards the Surrey docks. "He'll go over and down," said Kell, already running for the stairs. "He'll not make the north shore on that tide. Not pulling. Sir, the wide boat. Come on." I have been in some undignified positions in Holmes's company, and few worse than the bottom of a Rotherhithe wherry at 6:20 on a November morning. But I will say for Ezra Kell that the man could row. He took us out and down at an angle I should have sworn was wrong, into the brown swirl of the point, and he did not once look at the skiff. "You are not following him," Holmes said. "I'm going where he's got to come." Kell's face was wet and perfectly calm. "He's pulling across the ebb like a gentleman. The set'll have him down on the tier by the wall in 3 minutes, and there's no room to turn under her stern. I told you, mister. I know boats." It fell out precisely as he said. Vale came down on the tier of moored lighters, saw the wall of them, tried for the gap, and lost 20 yards getting the skiff's head round. And when he came out from behind the last barge, we were lying across his bows with the police galley coming up hard from the Rotherhithe stairs behind him. He stopped rowing. He sat with the oars trailing and looked at us, a big grey-haired man in a good overcoat, breathing hard, in a boat with a bailing tin and a coil of line in the bottom of it. "You'll want the page," he said at last. "I have the index," said Holmes. Vale looked at him for a long moment. Then he did a thing I have thought about a great deal since. He took a folded paper out of his breast pocket, old paper, brown at the fold, with a line of red ruling visible along one edge, and he held it out over the side and let it go into the Thames. "Now you have nothing but a number," he said. "On the contrary," said Holmes, "I have a boat." I did not understand him. Bradstreet, coming alongside at that moment with 2 constables, did not understand him either. It was not until the skiff had been brought in to the mill wharf and Vale had been taken up to the counting-house with a constable on each side that Holmes went down on his knees in her, took out his lens, and began to work along the stern sheets and the bottom boards. And when he stood up, he had on the flat of his hand a small pinch of fine red dust, and among it, pale and unmistakable, the flakes and grains that I had beaten out of a dead man's coat in a parish mortuary a week before. "Brick dust and camphor," said Holmes. "There is one room in London that smells of those 2 things together, Inspector, and Nathaniel Sperry was carried out of it on his back and down 4 steps and put into this boat under a piece of tarpaulin at 2:30 in the morning on the 17th of October. Mr. Kell watched it done from under the coal tier." "I know boats," said Kell. He was standing on the stairs with his cap in his hands, staring at the skiff. "That's her. That's the one come off Saltyard stairs. I'd know her on the Day of Judgment." And Bradstreet, who had been running his thumb along the underside of the stern thwart, held it up in the grey light, and it was brown. Cornelius Vale was tried at the Central Criminal Court in the following January for the wilful murder of Nathaniel Sperry. He was defended with great ability, and the defence was the one he had built for himself in October, that the Saltyard records were a proven fraud, engrossed for years by an unauthorised hand, condemned by the Home Office itself, and that a line in the index of such a book was worth nothing at all. It might even have served him had the case rested on the index alone. But the Crown called a chemist upon the ink, and the chemist was unshakable, and the Crown called Ezra Kell upon the boat, and the Crown called a physician upon the question of drowning, and the Crown produced the dust out of the bottom boards. What finished him, I think, was none of these. It was that the jury had before them, all through the trial, the photograph of a page of a register, at the foot of which a man had written the name of a murderer and the name of a victim 3 days before there was a murder or a victim, and no advocate in England could explain to 12 men why a forger who wished to hide a crime should write down the crime in advance except in the way Holmes explained it in 9 minutes from the witness box. He was convicted and he was hanged in the spring, and he never said one word about the man Byatt, who died at Portland in 1874, and of whom nothing now remains anywhere in the world except a name and an age in an index, in a book that was fished out of a heap of waste paper 11 minutes before it went into a boiler. Josiah Doyne was not prosecuted. The Home Office, having looked at the thing from every side, discovered in itself a wish not to be seen putting a blind man of 63 into the dock for having gone on doing his work, and the county allowed him a pension of £40, which was £31 less than justice and about £40 more than he had expected. His daughter was bound over. She was in court to hear it, and she thanked the magistrate, and outside on the pavement she was ill. She writes still. It is her own hand now, small and quick and nothing like her father's, and she is copying clerk to a solicitor in Newington who knows her whole history and says he never had a better. There is one thing more, and then I have done. A court record may not be erased. Whatever is written in the book stands in the book. If it is wrong, it is not scraped out, but left, and the truth is set beside it in the margin. So the last-minute book of the Salt Yard Sessions House lies now in the county's keeping at Newington, with the false entry still upon it, in ink that grows blacker every year, in the beautiful upright hand that Hester Doyne taught herself at 14, out of love for her father, Ezra Kell, waterman, age 31. Wilful murder of Nathaniel Sperry. Guilty. Judgment of death recorded. And beneath it, in a small, quick, quite different hand, and signed with her own name. This entry is false. It was written on the night of October 14th, 1891 by Cornelius Vale, who 3 days afterwards committed the murder it describes.